So when it comes to retro games on the channel, I tend to spend a lot of time talking about 5th gen throwbacks, specifically within the horror genre. But even outside of horror, there are tons of amazing games that you can explore that, while they are technically modern creations, look like they could have stepped straight out of the 80s, 90s, or early 2000s console eras. So that's what today's video is all about, is I just want to go over 5 different games that, while they are definitely modern creations, certainly have their roots way back in the 80s, 90s, or, again, early 2000s. And with all that being said, let's go ahead and kick this list off with a 3D Metroidvania of sorts, Pseuduoregalia. And right from the jump, Pseuduoregalia is inspiring with its dreamy aesthetic, albeit a very 5th generation one. And what's really weird is when I fired this up, it actually already had a save file for me, and for the life of me I don't remember ever playing it, which is a little bit spooky, and looking back at my production notes, I didn't even see where I'd ever mentioned this game before, but I digress. From the outset, you'll be controlling a goat-like creature named Sybil, who finds herself trapped in a castle. And it's immediately clear that this is just a really cleanly designed game. In addition to swinging your weapon, the Dreambreaker, you can toss it away temporarily and it slams into the ground with a satisfying weight. Aside from smoothly running around and jumping, you can also crouch and backflip, which seems like a nice nod to Link, which is perfectly appropriate given the late 90s presentation and enchanting score underpinning the on-screen action. Along the way, and in line with the Metroidvania formula, you'll start unlocking new abilities that allow you to explore previously inaccessible areas. Initially, you'll start out by unlocking a basic slide ability, but then quickly realize that it's vital to your survival since it's also used as a quick means of dodging what turned out to be some pretty powerful enemies. Thankfully, save points are liberally peppered throughout each stage, and you can save quickly by hitting them with your weapon and moving on. As far as health goes, you can also drain your magic power to restore your health, but doing so will detract from your attack range, which will make for an interesting tug of war between survival and combat effectiveness. And speaking of combat, I was not prepared for the level of challenge that this game was offering up. I kind of figured it would be a cutesy hack and slash of sorts, with only a light dusting of Metroidvania, before it gave me a pretty respectable helping of Dark Souls on the first boss that I encountered. But that difficulty isn't hollow by any stretch. Demanding, sure, but it's totally fair, and the first time I lost to a boss, I knew exactly what I'd done wrong, which only inspired me to rush back in full force and finish the job. All this is to say, it's not just the visuals that are retro, but so too is the difficulty, and I love that while it felt fair, it certainly didn't pull any punches. But make no mistake, the difficulty here doesn't just come from the combat, but it's also a legitimately thrilling platforming challenge. I kept waiting for a double jump ability early on, but was amused instead to find a bubble jump mechanic. It works by jumping into one of these free-floating bubbles, which will allow you to rocket off to further platforms and perform your jump in the middle of it to get that extra distance that you'll often need. Aside from being clever, it was incredibly demanding because every rope you can grab or ledge you can just barely grasp is perfectly accessible if you have the precision to line up your jump correctly. A little later on, you'll also unlock the ability to wall jump up to 3 times, and let me tell you, some of these jumps are absolutely diabolical, and not just because of their placement, but also because of the way enemies are placed to impede your progress. Again, it's tough, but ultimately fair. As for the Steam Deck experience, it worked perfectly fine out of the box with no controller difficulties or visual inconsistencies to speak of. There's not a lot to configure in terms of performance options outside of your resolution and frame rate, but honestly it plays just fine, offering up a smooth 60 FPS experience. Well, I say smooth, but there are also options to engage a retro animation frame rate to give Sybil that stilted Into the Spider-Verse look, and it works really well here. My only real complaint so far is that the stylized font that's used to indicate interactable NPCs or environmental elements can be a little bit hard to read sometimes, but honestly that's a pretty minor gripe. The most important takeaway here is that Pseuduoregalia feels very precisely crafted to satisfy any retro fan's desire for a stiff challenge. So if you're interested not only in a game that looks like it came from a bygone era, but one that'll challenge you accordingly, Pseuduoregalia is more than up to the task. Next up, let's take a look at another game that looks like it came from the 5th generation, and it definitely puts up a stiff challenge too, albeit one that you can temper a bit thanks to some very smartly designed difficulty options, and that would be the Cyberpunk first-person shooter, Sprawl. Stepping into the boots of a super soldier named Seven, you'll be facing off against government forces and trying to find your way out of a dystopian walled city. But thanks to your cybernetic implant and a mysterious voice that provides helpful, if not suspicious guidance, you won't have to go it alone. And what struck me most from the outset is just how clean the design is here. Movement is immediately intuitive, and helpful floating displays guide you along its opening moments to help you get familiar with its mechanics, the biggest of which are its wall running and adrenaline systems. The former lets you quickly reach new heights in each new environment, and the latter lets you slow everything down to better control it, while also serving as a helpful bullet time system for combat scenarios. And you'll definitely need it, because even though there's a fairly limited amount of enemy types available, they will definitely put up a challenge. Sprawl also rewards you for either finishing off enemies by liberating their heads from their torso, or targeting their weak points. And performing either of these will cause your foes to spew forth a menagerie of gore and supplies like pixelated piñatas. But it's not always an easy feat to target these weak points, since you can frequently exhaust your adrenaline at the worst possible time, and have to stay on the move pretty much constantly if you want to survive. Not just laterally as you'd expect from the original Doom, but also vertically thanks to the wall running mechanic, which can let you quickly reach new heights to get a better vantage point on your foes. It's fast and fluid to be sure, but it is a little squirrely to get used to, and I found myself accidentally running off the side of buildings more than a few times until I finally got the hang of it. It should feel really familiar if you've at all played a modern Doom, where the ultra-violence is undercut by the cartoonish kaleidoscope of colorful goodies that you get rewarded with like every 2 seconds. It's not exactly a new idea, but it's one that works pretty well, and as long as the movement and gunplay is fun, who cares if it really toes the line between homage and derivative. On its face, Sprawl is very clearly inspired by the earliest first-person shooters, and its movement feels like a combination of both classic and modern Doom. This is actually pretty overtly confirmed when you finish the first level and get an achievement for clearing E1M1, and as someone who was there for the original Doom, this definitely brought a smile to my face. But it's not just Doom that's painting the world of Sprawl. You can also feel the influence of a variety of other works, from Ghost in the Shell, to The Matrix, to Mirror's Edge, and naturally Max Payne, what with the bullet time and all. And yet, for all of its influences clearly on display, Sprawl still feels like its own thing. The only real complaints I have so far are that the aim assist feels occasionally spotty, and getting the hang of the wall running definitely took a little longer than I expected. But hey, if you need a little bit of extra help, you can always turn on God mode in the menu if you'd prefer. Because just like the gameplay, the menus too are fast, responsive, and clearly laid out, which makes it a breeze to make any tweaks to your controller setup or visual settings. Speaking of which, you'll probably need to do at least a little bit of tweaking here, because while Sprawl comfortably runs above 40 FPS most of the time at higher settings, if you want to get a solid 60, you'll need to scale back the visuals pretty dramatically. But honestly, since it's going for that retro aesthetic anyways, I don't really have any complaints about dropping it to its lowest visual quality to stay closer to 60 FPS, and in fact, all of the footage that you're looking at right now is being shown at the lowest possible visual setting. Ultimately, Sprawl serves as a fun little cyberpunk adventure that's not perfect, but it's definitely polished, and if you're hungry for an old school FPS with some modern movement mechanics, it certainly fits the bill. But now let's go a bit further back into the 2D realm of gaming and ratchet that difficulty back up with the over-the-top, extremely violent and stylized Valfaris. Valfaris is a heavy metal infused 2D action platformer with some clear influences from games like Castlevania or Contra. You'll be playing as Therion, a warrior returning to his homeworld of Valfaris, only to find that it's devolved into utter chaos thanks to a range of demonic inhabitants who have taken over. And as soon as you dive into the fray, Valfaris feels amazing. You'll have a handful of weapons and abilities at the start, including Therion's sword and a plasma pistol which can be fired in 8 directions while stationary or moving, which should feel very familiar to anyone who's played titles during the 8 or 16-bit era. And the extremely vivid pixel art only drives this vibe home further. Not to mention, you do have a shield that you can use as you start laying waste to tons of demonic entities with ranged weapons and melee attacks, or by using your shield offensively by carefully timing its use to catch enemy projectiles and return to sender. But both of your special weapons and shield do require power to operate, so you'll need to be judicious about their use, knowing when to go all in the midst of chaos, and when to scale it back a little bit to your standard armaments to conserve that power for greater threats ahead. And you'll definitely face greater threats ahead because Valfaris pulls no punches in the challenge department. But despite the constant pressure from respawning enemies and tricky level designs, the difficulty always feels fair, and every time I bit it trying to juggle multiple enemies at once, I was always able to come back just a little bit smarter with some adjustments in my strategy. And the deeper in you get, the more numerous and capable your enemies will become. But the good news is, so too does Therion, as you'll regularly find new weapons, upgrade materials like blood metal, and boosts to counteract the ever-scaling challenges it throws at you. It also does a great job at mixing up the environments in such a way that you're not just exploring and knocking out bosses. Sometimes you'll encounter a challenge room where you might be given infinite energy for your shield and the Gatling gun like Hellwraith, but in turn the enemy count will ramp up considerably. It's chaotic, violent, and has blistering visuals and music to match, making it one of the most headbanging titles I've encountered since Doom. And all of this vivid imagery is punctuated by high-octane action that, despite its speed, is incredibly thoughtful. And most of the fun comes from the moment-to-moment calculations you have to do when dealing with differing enemy types. Like this beefy boy here, who can deal with you up close and at range, so managing how you use that energy becomes essential to your progress. Thankfully, Valfaris threads the difficulty needle pretty well, making it always feel like a fair challenge, and resurrection idols always show up at just the right time when you need them. So even though it's certainly demanding in its retro sentiment, it never falls into truly frustrating territory. And while it may not offer you a sprawling in-menu map to explore like a Castlevania, Valfaris sure does take some of the best elements of Castlevania like its boss battles, and adapts them here into exciting fights that build on the mechanics you've learned as you progress. And so the loop goes, exploring Valfaris to uncover its secrets, taking down ever more powerful bosses, unlocking rad new weapons, and making nuanced choices like exchanging resurrection idols for blood metal. On the deck, it performs flawlessly at a steady 60 FPS, and while customization options are sparse, you can enable one of 2 different CRT filters to really drive home that retro aesthetic, and I'd say that's my preferred way to play this one. At the end of the day, Valfaris is frenetic, punishing, and ludicrously stylish, but most of all, it's fulfilling as you continue to conquer its challenges. And ultimately, I'd recommend this to anybody who has a fondness for that old-school, trial-and-error struggle gauntlet type gameplay. But now let's ease up on the challenge just a little bit while still staying within the realm of 2D games, and check out a game that prioritizes fun and humor over raw challenge, and that would be Shakedown Hawaii. A follow-up to Retro City Rampage, Shakedown Hawaii is one part top-down action and one part simulation as you work your way through 126 story missions along with 83 shakedown opportunities and a whopping 396 different properties to acquire as you build your empire. And don't worry if that sounds intimidating, because right from the start you can choose easy difficulty if you'd rather focus on the story and monopolize the island even faster. Speaking of, the story revolves around an aging CEO whose company, Feeble Multinational, is failing thanks to advancements in technology like online shopping, video streaming, and ride-sharing apps. So in response to this, you opt to get aggressively unscrupulous to prevent your company's bankruptcy by violating consumer protection standards, destroying package delivery trucks, shaking down other businesses, and just generally doing every unsavory thing you can think of to get back on top. Beyond the main story and subplot involving your lazy son who mooches off of you, it's overflowing with biting commentary about corporate America, and the gaming industry in particular is frequently put in the crosshairs as it mocks every shady business practice you can think of. But hey, it also doesn't mind making fun of itself, so the whole thing comes off as pretty refreshing rather than being overly cynical. All of this plays out with some gorgeous pixel art and an appropriately synth-heavy soundtrack. And even with its simpler art style, the on-screen action of driving around, jacking cars either for fun or to just legally repo cars for your shady car leasing business, or mowing down hordes of pedestrians remains fun throughout. And I think one of the sharpest design decisions in this department is that lots of the environment is destructible, so you can pretty much disregard road safety in its entirety while you're evading the police or doing a job, and you'll never get frustrated because you got stuck on a bush or something. Making it so that you can run around on foot or in a vehicle and have it mostly be a frictionless experience is smart, because with so much happening on screen all the time, it'd be pretty frustrating to hit literal roadblocks all the time. But thankfully Shakedown avoids this almost entirely by letting you focus on having pure, messy, unadulterated fun as you roam the streets stirring up trouble and building out your empire. As a 2D affair, there's nothing here that's going to tax the Steam Deck in any significant way, so you can expect a perfectly smooth experience. And just like Valfaris, you can engage in a couple of retro CRT filters if you'd like to complete that old school vibe. I did have to manually select the first controller when playing in docked mode, but that's a pretty light inconvenience depending on whether or not you're even playing in docked mode, but just the same I wanted to go ahead and mention it. Ultimately, if you were a fan of GTA before it hit the third dimension, or just generally like top-down action, Shakedown Hawaii never fails to disappoint. And even as a very tongue-in-cheek throwback to the earliest entries of everyone's favorite crime simulator, it throws more than its fair share of new ideas into the mix for good measure. But now let's move away from the candy-coated lunacy of Shakedown Hawaii and towards a slower, more methodically paced, squad-based horror experience, and one that technically, and perhaps fittingly, does not belong on this list. Because just like its titular character, it's sneaking onto this list, trying to be something that it technically isn't, but honestly, after a recent snow day here in Columbus, and considering I did say I was going to make this game a priority in 2025, I couldn't not include it here, and that would be The Thing Remastered. So a couple of weeks ago, I went over the games that I missed in 2024, and I mentioned that this would be my top priority in 2025. And the truth is, originally I recorded 2 totally different games and segments for this final selection, but neither of them felt quite right. And while The Thing Remastered also doesn't quite fit, I just couldn't pass up the delicious irony of featuring a game that feels retro because it technically is retro on account of its being a remaster. Not to mention it also features paranoia-inducing shape-shifting aliens, so it felt like a natural fit. But with that meta commentary out of the way, let's go ahead and dive into this thing. Like I mentioned previously, this game serves as a direct sequel to John Carpenter's 1982 classic, The Thing. You'll be taking on the role of Captain Blake, who, along with a Special Forces team, must uncover what happened at the Thule Station Antarctic Geological Research Center. Upon arrival by helicopter, you find that most of the center has been rocked by heavy explosives damage, and so begins your recon mission to figure out what the heck happened here. You're on a tight schedule too, with only about an hour to complete your initial discovery, thanks to an impending snowstorm that leaves a slim window for your helicopter extraction. Complicating things further is that you have to manage your exposure to the cold, and can only be outdoors for a few minutes at a time before your health starts to dwindle, and you're responsible for keeping your squad not only alive, but sane. Stepping into what remains of the Thule station is immediately eerie. The wind howls through the ruins, and you'll need to keep a sharp eye on lights in the snow to keep your bearings amidst the limited visibility. In turn, your team is put more and more on edge as you make grislier discoveries deeper into the compound. And navigating the environment is tricky enough on its own, but you'll also need to lean on members of your team to perform specialized functions. Your engineer can control power flow to different portions of the station, while your medic and combat specialists keep your team alive and protected, respectively.
I'm locked, loaded, and ready to make shit dead.
But, crucially, they're only as good as their mental stability allows them to be. If their trust in your leadership starts to waver, or if they suspect you've become something else, they'll stop following your orders or outright rebel against you. To put your squad at ease, you'll have to do things like heal them up, limit their exposure to both the elements and the unsettling discoveries you're about to make, or provide them munitions to give them a sense of control or security. But there's the rub. Can you trust them? If you're not sure, do you really want to hand over an assault rifle to someone, or more appropriately, something that might not be on your side? Or is that stranded soldier you found really who he says he is? How can you really be sure? It's definitely a lot to keep track of, but thankfully there is an in-menu field manual that lays out the menagerie of nuances you have to consider while making your way through the complex. And you really have to hand it to the original developers here, because they were way ahead of their time in crafting a paranoia-inducing squad-based game, and making it work as well as it does here. Even if the learning curve's a bit steeper than something like Silent Hill, it's also extremely rewarding in a way that I haven't seen in another horror game so far. Sure, I've questioned the intentions of temporary allies before, but never in such a visceral way where something as simple as taking someone's gun away might have dire consequences not just for me, but for other members of my squad. And the moments of tension these mechanics produce are as diabolical as any alien you might encounter stalking you through the snow. Case in point, early on in my game, Weldon, my medic, was going a little bit off the rails after a chilling discovery. In an effort to soothe him, I gave him my sidearm, leaving me only with my machine gun. After my initial team was extracted, I carried on to track down the whereabouts of Alpha Team, the first on the scene, and ran into Carter. He too was rattled and mistrusting, but the only way I could get him to follow orders and clear the path forward was to give him my only remaining weapon and pray I was making the right choice.
Maybe you will get us out of this.
Don't get me wrong, The Thing Remastered has a structure and feel that is very much 2002 and is nearly too complicated for its own good. But once you get into the rhythm of exploration, problem solving, and combat, it all starts to become second nature. And I have to commend Night Dive Studios here for bringing the whole thing up to modern standards. The soul is intact, but the character models, environments, lighting, the trust versus fear system, they've all been overhauled for a better experience. And it runs brilliantly on the Steam Deck out of the box. All of the footage that you're seeing on screen is holding steady at a solid 60 FPS at 1080p resolution, and while the controls certainly take some getting used to, everything worked exactly as expected. So if you're looking for a chilling descent into madness and a brilliant follow-up to a horror classic, this one's an absolute must-buy, on sale or otherwise. And now I'm off to double-check my friends and family for signs of assimilation. Alright, and that's it for this one. Clearly I had the most fun with The Thing Remastered on this list, but hey, what about you? Are there any games that you've played recently that are modern creations but have their roots in retro gaming? If so, I would love to hear about it in the comments below. And as far as what's coming up on the channel, soon we'll be taking a look at all the games that are coming in February, and then also I'll be doing a little bit more retro game stuff with the Steam Deck, specifically focused on arcade experiences, so stay tuned for that. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, and if so, you definitely know where to find me. And as always, thank you so much for your time and hanging out here with me on the channel. I really, really appreciate it. Have an amazing day, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.